Before I start, I'd like to draw your attention to my friend here, the one prop that I'm going to use today, the chair. Because in our discussion about looking to the past to sustain the future, the raising of a blue continent, it's important first to remember who it is we represent, who's not in the room, who we advocate for. So I'm going to introduce the empty chair, and in Hawaii, there's a term. It's called kanoho pani haka haka. Kanoho, the chair, pani, to close. Haka haka, to represent. In other words, a proxy. And I encourage the groups I speak with and work with to remember that before we speak on behalf of others, or our beneficiaries, whether they be the whales, the wolves, or those veterans that we were talking about earlier, that we also consider them, though they may not be in the room. In my case, we think about our ancestors, those that came before us, those that give us identity, as well as the descendants who will follow, whom we give identity to, so that when we speak, we don't speak from our own singular perspectives. So I would offer this to you as well. As we convene and discuss over the weekend, or this week, to consider the empty chair. This discussion is going to be a voyage. I'd like to take you on a quick journey, and Polynesians are known to be some of the greatest voyagers, sailors on the planet. And it was demonstrated by a voyage by Nainoa Thompson using traditional practices. But this isn't just going to be a typical voyage. This journey or voyage is really a voyage of rediscovery. Because I'm borrowing from this particular writer who speaks to the idea that a real voyage is not discovering new things, but also developing new ways of seeing the things that are always in front of us anyway. So I'm hoping today that what I will try to do, or that we'll do collectively, is to begin to challenge supply-side thought. The things that we all came to the room with, the thoughts that we already had loaded when we entered the room, because we're really only limited to those things. Regardless of how many of us have come together, we're still limited to that which we bring to the room. And that supply-side thought tends to drive the way we respond or react to the challenges and opportunities that are in front of us. Additionally, what I'm hoping to do is to look at this proposition of possibilities through two schools of thought that I tend to subscribe to. And it basically is it problem solving or creating solutions? And my students know that's a loaded question when I ask them which is the difference or are they the same. Creating solutions changes conditions that cause problems. And so I'd like to suggest that one is reactive and the other is proactive. And I believe this gathering is a more proactive opportunity. And so I would look at this construct that I'm using for this presentation, that I'm challenging the structure, the order, and the relation. Not necessarily in that order, but as we look at opportunities in the future, sometimes our problems are nested in these three things and not necessarily in that order. And if we haven't found the solution, then we need to redefine the problem, and perhaps using these ingredients. The other part, for those of you architects and designers know this already, is form follows function, but more importantly, context shaping content. So the content of our conversation, at least the one I'm going into, has to do with a larger context. And that context, for me, happens to be a cultural context. This discussion, for me, also looks at shifting away from what we heard earlier, and I've been hearing in multiple months recently, this notion of a Western versus a non-Western approach, which automatically begins to suggest that one is greater than the other. Instead, being an islander, we begin to recognize that perhaps it's a different paradigm, or a different shift. And that is the difference between island thinking and continental thinking. Because wherever you are in the world, there's always someone more west than you. So I'm not sure where we start, especially on a circle. So the object is it really about west and east, or is it about context and the acknowledgement of what our limits are? How far can we go? What I've discovered is that when I'm on a continent, there's a tendency for people to think that there is an away. You can go away somewhere. You can send things away. You can throw trash away. But on an island, there is no away. Everything is there. And if you put it in the ocean, it comes back. So there is no away. And so in Hawaiian thought process, there's an olelo no eau, a proverb. And it says, "Ika na no ike." We learn by observing. And I think most of us as children recognize that. By watching and learning. And what I've learned and observed from the elders, the kupuna who taught me, is that if we pay attention, this place talks to us. But we also have to be very conscious of our biases. And so I'm going to ask you, from a supply-side thought, to challenge the biases that we enter any conversation, even when we're trying to challenge it and create a new paradigm. Because even in responding to that, we're already been biased by the way we've been taught. And as islanders, what we've learned is that when we think about our island in the middle of the sea, we're actually sitting on a much bigger island called Earth. It has the same characteristics of the islands that we live on. So we said, what has impacted our view of the world as islanders? Well, interesting enough, you have this, the European view of the world, which basically says that individuals like these two gentlemen, you may recognize them as Balboa and Magellan, in 1516 and 1523 thereabouts, Balboa fell into the Pacific and was credited with discovering the Pacific. Thank goodness for him, Polynesians now know where we are. Shortly thereafter, Magellan then took a fleet of ships into the Pacific, and he was credited with giving it a name. Prior to that, we just called it home. Since then, however, the world around us and everything that we're in has been defined by those who are lost and looking. And so we're asking, or trying to discover new things. Yet we were there for thousands of years, living in a way that was extremely sustainable. Prior to these two gentlemen entering the Pacific, there was another gentleman. We just celebrated Discoverers Day, who started out as Columbus Day. Of course, he was looking for India. A Native American friend of mine was commenting on that experience, and he says, you know, Columbus was looking for India, and that's why we're called Indians. We're sure glad he wasn't looking for Turkey. But if you notice the tagline, Columbus takes possession, that says a lot. That concept has spoken out in many ways and has been lived out through the paradigms and the decision-making screens that many of us have used since. Because really what it started saying was this: finders keepers. They were looking, they found it, and they kept it. Right? Now, everyone knows this adage, we all did it when we were kids. What's the second part to this? Losers, weepers. Right? And so what we're saying, why are we losers in this deal? Shouldn't we shift this paradigm and shift the notion that, yes, we knew where we were, and we have a lot to offer, and it shouldn't be a subset of something, but maybe equal or greater to, depending on the perspective that we use. And so the suggestion then is we go back to the time when Cook arrived in Hawaii, and he was credited with discovering the islands. Now, of course, we were there, but he's credited with discovering it, thank goodness. So I put this title up here, Hawaii's Transition to the New Global Economy. This didn't happen. This isn't happening now. It started with Cook's arrival there, and King Kamehameha, who was a youth at the time, was influenced by the technology, basically cannons. And he launched his own conquest of the islands and united them. So on one hand, while Cook discovered Hawaii, Native Hawaiians discovered cannons. And it started a whole new experience for us. Now, what has that experience done for us, and what has it done for me lately? So we're asking that question, and a friend of mine and I are going to try to rewrite the history, at least give it some perspective. So look for it on your shelves soon. It's going to be a book called The Hawaiian Cookbook. And with tongue-in-cheek, there's also a subtext. He came in peace and left in pieces. The point is, at some point, our world and the world of most of us who were not there has been shaped by others coming before us. And sometimes ignoring the fact that the information and knowledge that's already there may be as valuable to our future as the information that's being brought by the visitor or the invader, depending on their intent. And so the island worldview is really subject to this notion, were we really isolated? And when you talk to a Pacific Islander, that's not the case. In fact, when you look at the paradigm of thought or the way we think, most of you can fill in this statement. I think, therefore I am. And see, in the Pacific Island view, that's not the way our perspective operates. Because we understand that thinking is an important part, but it comes from this thing up here, the mind, which has an ability to rationalize. These rational lies lead us to other conclusions sometimes, but it always depends on the question. What are the questions? And when you think, we begin to have these questions of identity. And in the last 5 months, and in as many summits or conferences that I've been in, these seem to be the questions that continue to arise from the various sectors of the groups that I'm working with. Now, what's happening is that when we look at it from Pacific view, this is what one Tongan elder told me recently. Because Ramsay, our ancestors looked at it from this perspective. I belong, therefore I am. It's that sense of belonging versus the need for belongings. The idea that I belong to something greater than myself, that I can be anywhere in the world on a plane or a train, and I know where I belong. I know what I belong to. I have an identity that is not defining me by the externalities, but the ability to center in self versus being self-centered. Because it comes from a deeper place, a place that I come from. Now, I would suggest that we are all indigenous to some place, some of us more connected than others. But it also talks to our language, speaks to our language and how we see ourselves. Predicate, noun, noun, predicate. In the islands, we look at the concept of human being versus being human. For us, being human is more important. I'm Ramsay, the son of Remigius and Barbara Jean, who are the sons and daughters of, and a genealogy follows. And by the way, I happen to be a presenter today. Well, others I deal with, when you ask them who they are, they'll give you their title, and if you take that away from them, sometimes they don't know who they are. Human being something versus being human doing something. And so this ties us back to our places. In fact, when you asked the Hawaiian before, he would say, "Who are you?" And the answer would be, "He Hawaii, I am Hawaii." Why? Because it's a reciprocity agreement. Daniel spoke about it earlier. I eat the land, it eats me. We give back what we receive. As a result, my ancestors are here, I'm here, I will be here, and my descendants will be here. The object is that we are one. There is a symbiotic reciprocity agreement that continues generation to generation. And so this notion of context shaping content then, let's expand it and say, where do we all belong? In the case of the Pacific, this notion is, that's the context. Not an island, but an entire continent. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to introduce you to the blue continent. We're shifting from an island thinking to a continental thinking. Why? With much of the work that I'm doing, I'm finding that continental thinkers that I work with tend to have a set of metrics and parameters that they operate from that do not apply, that are irrelevant to an island community. When I was working in water quality management, the EPA had a set of standards for streams, continental streams, that when we applied those standards, they would kill the fish on our islands. And I had to ask the question, what other parameters are being imposed upon this community and others like it based on a continental thinking paradigm? And so by looking at this, you'll see quickly what happens. Based on this knowledge, islanders are not disconnected by ocean. We're actually connected by water. And when you think about the entire continent of the Pacific, here are some of the characteristics. It's larger than the total land area of the world, 156 million square kilometers, bounded by 36,000 kilometers of coastline. The natural resources that are there, home to endangered marine species, and it is a major contributor to the world economy. By shifting it from islands to continental thinking, we've changed the economies of scale. Before others come into the Pacific and begin to exploit the resources there, human and otherwise, we're asking them to consider that there are some stewards there. People have a relationship with the place that may be able to help us in the 21st century needs because we understand our place better than they do. And together, we can move forward rather than as subservient to a process that we have no participation in. And so we ask others who come then to rethink this, that the islands of Hawaii, the place that I come from, as well as other islands, may indeed be the mountaintops of the mountain ranges that define this continent called the Blue Continent. So you can see it. Hawaii is actually a series of mountains, a mountain range that starts at the bottom of the sea. Now this context also applies to its name. The word ha means breath of life, the essence of life, the space between you and I, the atmosphere in this room. The word vai means water, which all of us are made up of, 75% or more, I'm told. And the last concept refers to E, the creative energy that's created all things, you and I. It's in you, it's in me, it's in the world around us. And when you put these three words together, ha, vai, E begins to speak to a proposition of behavior. Care for the air, care for the water, and care for the spirit of one's relationships with your friends as well as your places. So the very name begins to guide our practices and our behaviors. Now, we may not be doing that today because we've adopted the principles and policies of others, but is there a way that we can recapture these value sets and concepts and bring them forward? In the same way that those of us who sought out knowledge from those sitting on mountaintops, we climbed to the mountains to ask the sages. Let me offer you this, that perhaps the people, the cultures, and the land themselves may actually be the elders that we need to turn to. That the knowledge and information we need in the 21st century may actually be sequestered within these islands themselves. So let me rush because I'm going to be behind on time here, a little ambitious today. Mark Twain said that this was the loveliest fleet of ships, or fleet in the Pacific. He was really likening us to ships, but Hawaii is more like a life raft. We don't have a home port. We can't get new supplies. None of those things come up. This is it. 85% of our food comes from someplace else. 90% or more of our fuel comes from someplace else. We don't want to invite 7 million people to our life raft every year, but we do. It's called tourism. How do we feed ourselves? How do we take care of everyone else? Bottom line, it comes down to ships, ironically. Not so much the small ships, but the big ships, starting with relationships. It's about our relationships to one another and to our places. But the relationship isn't guided just by ownership. This was something that our people did not understand. Ownership was not part of the practice. Stewardship that was founded in kinship. These ships, I am part of this place. I'm related to it. I'm related to you. Therefore, I have a responsibility to you and everyone else around me. Once it got to ownership, I lost some of that. And so our value set then starts with the idea that our island is like a canoe. Our canoe is like an island. And the earth that we are is a canoe in which we all are now riding. We all have a responsibility to our canoe, and we need to take the time to recognize that our future is our past and our past is our future. At some point in time, we need to understand that we can't get there using the methods that brought us here in the first place. At some point, we need to change that paradigm. Perhaps we need to look at the languages and the concepts and the stories of the past, to listen to the things that others have already learned. They managed to live in this place for thousands of years without planes and ships, sustainably. Is there something that we can bring forward? For instance, the letter A means fire or energy in Hawaiian. The letter I, E, represents water, fire and water. When you put these two energies together, you get a word called ai, but you also get steam. Steam is a form of energy. Interesting enough, the word ai is the word for food, feed, or eat, which all refers to energy. Now, in one word, these people have captured the caloric exchange formula of heat and water and steam and creating energy. Now, is there something we can learn from that? That the air, the water, the land, and sea is really that thing that provides us with energy. And in Hawaiian, we call that aina, that thing that will be here to feed us tomorrow. That relationship drives us to place-based, culture-based approaches that says maybe we need to look at the place in a different way. Rather than looking at resources, we now look at them as capital. As a result, everything is being looked at through a capital lens. Our ancestors looked at our places differently. We started with the land that created the societies that we're in. And Daniel touched on that earlier. The economy of exchange, currency of exchange, was really coming out of that relationship with their places. And we supplemented what wasn't there from someplace else. Unfortunately, in a globalized economy, we're now importing much of that from other places, which means the model isn't as balanced as it used to be. Does that look like a balanced model to you? It's not an indictment, it's an observation. At some point in time, this is going to fall apart, and I think we're experiencing some of that today. So the object is, how do we apply a place-based approach that is really founded in a set of values that really edifies the notion of interconnectedness? That we're all connected to one another and to our places. And that rather than ownership, looking at kinship, being related to those places, that we begin to operate on a new set of values with a new set of lenses, a vision. Values such as aloha, that speaks to the idea of giving and receiving. The notion that it isn't a world that is half full or half empty. In fact, when you have aloha mai, that of giving aloha, and aloha aku, the receiving of that aloha, that you actually leave as a full cup. The notion of aloha, these two faces, says that when you're in the face of someone else, do not damage the air because you damage your own. It also speaks to the notion that rather than looking at carrying capacity, that perhaps our shift from the value to malama aina, which means to care for, that dropping one word or one letter here can make the difference. It's called caring capacity. So the value set of aloha and the practices that go along with caring, how then can we feed everyone? In Hawaii, there was a poi bowl. That poi bowl is what told all of us it's time to eat. But more importantly, think about the empty chair, the person that's not here. Think about the next generation. Don't eat everything there now. This word kuleana means to enjoy the privileges and benefits of the future, we need to live up to the obligations and responsibilities of the present. This concept of kuleana, of feeding all people, says that maybe our metric systems need to be readjusted. That if we're looking for success, we need to shift the model or the context as well as the content by shifting the metrics that we apply to measure that. For instance, did you eat may be the answer. Has everyone been fed? When my grandmother saw me, she never asked me how I was. She'd always ask me, boy, did you eat? And before I left, she'd ask me, have you had enough? And if I said yes, she would then say, good, take some home. Her measure of success was whether or not everyone in her presence had eaten. Can you imagine if we asked that question of ourselves in our companies? A Hawaiian elder, not a Hawaiian elder, but a Yaqui elder, a good friend of mine from California, said this to me. The wealth of a society is measured by the health and well-being of its children. If we don't hear our children laughing, screaming with joy and glee, then we may be a poorer society. It's about that seventh generation. How do we take care of them? And so while we gather at functions like this to think about different things, I would subscribe to this, that it's not so much what we think, it's about what we do. We may have to cast our nets a little wider. We can think about all these wonderful things, but at some point in time, we have to act. And so the question is, what will our collective legacies be? Will it be a place that is welcoming? Will we be able to share our culture practices with one another? And here I ask this question, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? If not here, then where? We have the opportunity to do this. But I'd like to offer this, that we all consider and remember that we are all islanders suspended in the sea of space on an island called Earth. And so, with this in mind, the question, or an observation. There are times when the most difficult decision is to acknowledge what is already obvious to us all. How obvious is that? Are we going to live in a world that is always half full or half empty? I borrow from my friend John and his grandmother's lesson. Like this glass, half full, half empty. The upper part of the glass has air in it. The lower part has vi, and it's always filled with light. We're always full. It's a matter of how we look at it. So do we leave here full? Maybe. Just imagine what it would be like if we could do this. It's possible. Thank you.